Hi, I'm Michael French. I'm here today at the invitation of Beastly Books and George R.R. Martin, and I want to thank them for allowing me to spend a few minutes talking about my new novel, Cliffhanger. A few words about myself. I've been with my wife in Santa Fe, New Mexico since 1978. We've raised our two children here. We started a real estate firm from scratch. And in the last 7 or 8 years, we founded a nonprofit called Dollars for Schools to help Santa Fe public school teachers meet their classroom expenses. I grew up in Southern California in a small little community called Toluca Lake. Went to public schools, got into Stanford miraculously, then went on to Northwestern, got a master's degree, was drafted in the Army during the Vietnam era, and somewhere along the way I picked up the habit, if not the addiction, of writing. When I say addiction, I think a lot of other writers would identify with that word, because whether you like it or don't like it, and some days are good and some days are bad, you keep going back to it. I like to always say when I finish a book, and I've written maybe 22, 23 published novels, adult fiction, young adult, biographies, art criticism, I like to think this is my last book because it was so damn hard. And I'm not totally satisfied with it. And then you come to the realization that, well, if you were totally satisfied, you probably would stop writing. Because you're not satisfied, you say, well, I'll give it one more go. If I had to describe one attribute that I do like about my writing, that I take pride in and am always trying to improve it after all these years, it's characterization. I'm a believer that plots are very important. You need to have the reader turn the page to get to the end. But when you finish a book, at least for me, if it's a good plot, it's because the characters stay in my mind. And to do a good character, a three-dimensional character, a character in conflict, a character who can be moody and petulant at one point in time and then suddenly be not angelic, but at least open-minded and helping others, is what I strive for. And if someone says to me, well, why do you, or how do you create those kind of characters, because every book has different characters, it's because I think in myself, as in most writers, we have those same sides. We have the moody side, the petulant side, the skeptical side, the very sincere side, the hopeful side, fearful, the whole range of emotions. And when you're an adolescent and you first start writing, those are the very emotions you grope with the most. Before reading the 3 sections I want to share on this video, I want to make it clear that there are hints in these sections about what happens in the middle of the story, but they do not foretell what happens at the end of the plot. So, spoiler alert if you want to read the book and find out everything for yourself. But I'm hoping these 3 passages will entice you to buy the book, read the book, open the book, maybe even talk about the book to friends, because they illustrate what is really going on in the year 2030 at a small high school in Indiana, at least in my judgment. This is the very beginning of the book. Tuesday morning, Stuart Wilson would remember, carried no hint of anything out of the ordinary. His eyes skimmed the cloudless sky, as blue as a dream, he thought, almost falling into a reverie. The air came with a light chill. The 29-year-old Senate staffer was happy to be away from D.C. politics for a week. He ambled down Church Street with his girlfriend, searching for a breakfast spot. Wall Street stragglers bustled past them, slipping into different glass and steel high-rises, another long day ahead. After breakfast, around 8:45, what sounded like a sonic boom froze Stuart on the sidewalk. His equally mystified girlfriend said, "What the hell?" Moving cautiously down Church Street, their eyes fixed on a glowing orange hole in the north tower of the World Trade Center, maybe 50 floors up. People were gathered on the sidewalk in small, confused groups, barely talking as their necks craned up. As if from a chimney, heavy smoke was blowing from the gaping wound and sweeping leisurely over lower Manhattan. On the street level, tenants and visitors were rushing out of the tower's revolving doors that seemed to move in fits and starts. Stewart's mind went telegraphic. Firefighters would come any minute. No need to panic. Was this some accident or an act of terrorism? His girlfriend tugged on his arm to leave. He realized they were too close to the building, that the fire inside could spread, or there could be another explosion, but Stewart couldn't pry himself from the spectacle. Sheets of paper began to flutter out of the gash, sailing downward like pirouetting birds. The belching smoke grew darker. Then he witnessed something that he knew he would never, ever forget. From a blown-out window, a man and a woman, arms circled around each other, jumped silently to their deaths. Stewart turned his head away and wondered, were they total strangers or friends? Had they had time to call their loved ones? Were they petrified by fear, or had they somehow found peace? Stewart took his girlfriend's hand and hurried with strangers through a gauntlet of hastily erected barriers and police officers with megaphones. In the near distance, sirens began to throb against the sky. He listened to someone claim that a small plane had crashed deliberately into the 110-story edifice. But if it was an act of terrorism, Stewart questioned, might not a bomb or a missile have been more effective? He needed more information. As they kept running, the fear of the unknown trickled into his stomach, sour and indigestible. He was a rational man, he realized, who was now freaking out. Stewart knew that disasters, the kind that history remembered, often seemed to descend out of nowhere, like an avalanche. But that was an illusion. There were usually clues and foreshadowing, plenty of them when you examine things in the passage of time. For now, what had once been an impregnable steel fortress loomed in Stewart's imagination like a wobbly castle of Lego blocks. As they ran, Stewart and his girlfriend helped an older couple find shelter in the lobby of an apartment building. Peeking back at the inferno, his thoughts flipped to a Gothic painting he'd seen in Europe last summer. Massacre of the Innocents by the 16th century Dutch artist Borgel the Elder was a canvas of astonishing brutality of soldiers slaughtering young children. The painting had repulsed him, yet he couldn't free his gaze from it so easily. Terror had lodged in his mind like a fishhook, as it was doing now, and maybe he could never pull it out cleanly. The two flagged a taxi. At Grand Central Station, people were getting news from radios and flip phones. A little after 9 o'clock, he learned that a second commercial jet had struck the South Tower. Stewart helped his girlfriend, who lived in Philadelphia, board an Amtrak train for 30th Street Station 2 hours away. A separate train ferried Stewart back home to D.C. The news came in waves. Or were they rumors, he wondered? People were saying things that Stewart suspected were exaggerations or outright false. One of history's worst enemies was fear, he had learned in graduate school, because fear allowed you to distort or rationalize almost anything. Despite wild stories to the contrary, a third plane actually slammed into the Pentagon. Still another, targeting the White House, crashed in a Pennsylvania farm field. In the end, both towers collapsed. Early estimates of the dead were reported to be 10,000, until the truth settled on a number closer to 3,000. In his Washington apartment, little could erase the memory of the couple leaping to their deaths. Stewart wondered if he'd had the courage to do something desperate like that. At least the man and the woman had the dignity of choice, exercising free will. Jump before you get pushed, Stewart remembered his father telling him years ago. Their family had chosen to leave their foreclosed home voluntarily before the sheriff could throw them out. Watching the news, fresh insights tumbled down on Stewart. Using passenger-filled planes to destroy the towers was far more effective than a missile or a bomb, he began to realize. The terrorists were playing with your head, stoking the idea that next time you would be on one of those planes. Stewart was already feeling survivor's guilt. He listened to one idiotic commentator claim that the horrific tragedy was the fault of the dead, and those running for their lives. The real victims, the commentator added, were the perpetrators, martyrs for their religion in a war with their oppressors. In most wars, Stewart knew, moral blame was often propaganda, and a distant second in importance to the physical, psychological, and economic toll on both sides. The next day, Stewart dug out a book he'd last read in high school in Des Moines, Iowa, during a self-described mystic phase that still impacted his thinking. The book was first published in 1555 by Nostradamus, a French apothecary and self-proclaimed prophet. Stewart felt disdain for history's charlatans, but something about Nostradamus's prophecies riveted him. The Great Fire of London in 1666, the French Revolution of 1789, the American Civil War, the rise of Hitler, the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Japan, the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. Then, among still more tragedies, he referenced what many would come to interpret as the annihilation of the Twin Towers. Quote, 2 steel birds will fall from the sky on the metropolis. The sky will burn at 45 degrees latitude. Fire approaches the great new city. Immediately a huge scattered flame leaps up. Within months, rivers will flow with blood. The undead will roam the earth for a little time. End quote. Stewart questioned how a self-proclaimed oracle 450 years ago had intuited so much. Lucky guesses? Because Nostradamus wrote in flowery stanzas, his distractors said he was purposely vague, and thus his predictions were a hoax. But the seer had his defenders, especially his contemporaries, who wrote about his genius in mathematics and early astronomy. Days later, in a Washington bookstore with overcrowded shelves, Stewart found a scholarly paperback dotted with footnotes. Nostradamus, echoed the author, believed the alignment of stars and planets, including Earth, foretold the distant future. The author also claimed that Nostradamus had predicted one event that he didn't dare publish. His idea was blasphemous in the eyes of the church, and he knew that heretics had been imprisoned for lesser offenses. The censored prediction was passed down word of mouth over the centuries. In the year 2048, Nostradamus claimed, a string of political assassinations would push the world toward chaos, godlessness, and possible extinction. People would be imprisoned by their own fears, and their helplessness would allow others to strip them of their humanity. Were prophecy, Stewart wondered, any more reliable than wanton rumors? Throughout history, both attracted the political fringes. He had doubts about the 2048 prediction, especially the precise year, but it made him think about the possibility of a future of manipulated emotions. He began to see his PTSD as more than deep-seated anxiety. It was perhaps a harbinger of a very nasty world to come. Terrorism might take a break now and then, but would only grow more sophisticated and perhaps become a new way of waging war. Rather than keep score by wiping you off the face of the planet, your enemy would brainwash you to become one of them. Months later, Stewart moved from D.C., determined never to live again in a densely populated city. The aftershocks of vulnerability and grief seemed as numbing as the attacks themselves. Pursuing a career in politics began to lose its allure for him. Over coffee one day, unfolding a map, Stewart stabbed his finger at a small city in Indiana. He had never heard of Hawthorn, but he guessed it was quiet and out of the way, and insulated from the dreams of unpredictable fanatics. It's going to be helpful for me to read something I just recently wrote for a publication that wanted to know more about the book, and then that way I can begin reading passages that will make sense to everybody as opposed to just seeming like random episodes. So imagine a world in the year 2030 from the point of view of the fictitious city of Hawthorn, Indiana, population 40,000. Imagine a city in decline because of a lack of a skilled workforce, a prolonged economic recession, constant wars abroad, and a broke federal government with a $35 trillion debt. For most people in Hawthorn, everyday existence is a cliffhanger. National and multinational corporations seem to have all the money, as well as serious political influence in Washington. One foundation in particular, known as PTE, or Prosperity Through Education, is run by a charismatic attorney who believes that Washington D.C. and Congress are full of too many groups of gray hairs, old people. He is quietly leading a revolution to groom younger people with fresh ideas to run for government. Now, imagine a Hawthorn High senior named Britt Kittredge, who is very bright, but very ordinary in other ways. She has no interest in politics, but she does have one abiding characteristic. From childhood, she's chosen the path of unbridled curiosity. She's never run into an unmarked door where she doesn't wonder what's behind it. No matter how bad things get, she hangs in with her parents, her friends, and her career dreams of being a doctor. Her history teacher, Mr. Wilson, knows there's something special about Britt that not even Britt is fully aware of. When an opening comes for a new candidate to take on the overwhelming favorite for student body president, Mr. Wilson begins tailoring his class lessons specifically for Britt. It becomes clear that he wants her to run against the incumbent, and he wants her to win. Somebody has to make history, important history, like saving the planet history, he tells her. She thinks, how can a high school election be so important to her future, to the world's future? And how does one even know when one makes history? Mr. Wilson can't really mean her, she thinks. Is she not supposed to be just a small city doctor when she gets out of medical school? When she learns he was an eyewitness to 9/11, an event that happened well before she was born, he describes it to Britt so vividly after class one day, the terrorism opens her imagination to the possibility of history repeating itself. He tells her it's not just possible, it's inevitable, and perhaps only she can stop it. I'm going to read different sections with these different characters. The most important one, obviously, is Britt. She's the heroine. Then there's Matthew Navarro, who she's running against for student body president. He's the faraway favorite to win. He has his own personal political team of 15 students who do all his work for him. He seems to have almost an unlimited budget in pursuing his goal. And in addition to Matthew and his team, he has a best friend from grade school named Nathan. And we don't know for many, many pages what is the cement that brought them together in 5th grade that has lasted all this long. Nathan is a computer guy. He's good at running an organization, but he's got a pretty dark side to him, and he rubs a lot of people the wrong way. Outside of that, we have the standard principal, and we have the vice principals, friends of Britt, the many, many friends of Matthew. As they get into their struggle for running for student body president, she's not given a chance by anybody, but she becomes more and more curious about Matthew, a boy she admires like so many other people admire him, but something is off, and she's determined to find out what, and that's going to be the heart of her campaign. So let me start with, if I may, chapter 1. Over breakfast, Matthew Navarro's mother recited the day's headlines from her tablet. It was Hazel's morning ritual. Quote, automation continues to wipe out American jobs. Medicare and Social Security payments are cut by another 5%. 23rd country joins International Nuclear Club. Fire twisters ravage Australia again. Sometimes the high school senior thought his mom's despair seemed bottomless when she read the headlines. He understood their importance and sympathized with those caught up in a world of chronic uncertainty. But mostly he worried for his mom. Was her fixation going to accomplish anything other than to make her more and more anxious? Something was always exploding somewhere on the planet, he had told her. Something was always going wrong. It was the fall of 2030. The Arctic was gone, the Amazon rainforest was mostly gone, and lowland populations everywhere were fleeing to higher ground to rebuild their cities. On the chaos spectrum, things had been haywire since the day he was born, if not well before. You had little control over the roller coaster of seemingly man-made disasters, Matthew conceded, but how you lived your life in times of danger was a personal choice. Mom, it's Wednesday, he said mindfully, leaving a $100 bill on the kitchen table. Mani-pedi appointment, right? I don't need that much money, sweetie. God provides. His lips curled upward in resignation. God, as best Matthew knew, was Hazel's monthly government assistance check. He didn't mind that he had to supplement it with his own money. Treat yourself to something afterwards, Mom. You love chocolate. Who doesn't? You're the best thing in my life, better than chocolate. A frosted blonde with large red frame glasses, Hazel, in addition to fretting about the world, enjoyed bridge, reading romance novels, and popping Hershey Kisses in her mouth in lieu of cigarettes. Matthew told her she was going to live forever. Who wants to live forever? She replied, like immortality might be overrated. I do, Matthew thought half seriously. He was careful about what he said around his mother and at school. There were parts of his life that he knew were best kept a secret. He always walked a mile from their apartment to Hawthorn's only high school. There he lingered by the flagpole, expecting to meet Nathan. Expecting, he thought, gazing around, but not counting on it. Nathan time, as Matthew described the clock in his best friend's head, rarely coincided with anyone's smartwatch or smartphone. Nathan was a strident, often annoying computer geek, but Matthew knew he could never get mad at Nathan. They had too much history together. The rope of the flag snapped repetitively against its pole as gusts of wind descended. Matthew hurried alone the first period when Nathan didn't show up. His mind wandered to football, where he always ignored crazy weather like this, the pain in his hip or knee, overdue homework, girls, and even the latest election he was running in. Once in his endorphin zone, he felt like a superhero, able to penetrate defensive lines and to throw a football 60 yards for a touchdown. Cheering from the bleachers was sometimes deafening. If the crowd was too quiet, he worried, that meant he wasn't trying hard enough. Football had begun for Matthew in 7th grade. His dad had attended every game, not so much for a parent's love for his child, Matthew felt, or even a feeling of obligation, but a bond with his own athletic youth. Lettering in every major sport at Hawthorn High, his dad's achievements made the sports section of multiple news outlets. Loyalty to your school, Frank Navarro liked to say so often that Matthew tuned out the message, was everything. Otherwise, the car mechanic was a quiet man, a ghost who slipped in and out of rooms without seeming to use the door. As Matthew was entering 8th grade, his father began talking about needing some personal time off. One Saturday morning, he departed with a large suitcase on a bus for Mexico, promising Hazel and Matthew to return soon. Matthew didn't get it. Was his dad possibly mad at him or Hazel? Was there something sketchy going on in Mexico? Had he lost his mind? Once in Mexico City, his social media photos showed him at famous landmarks, sometimes with women friends he said he had made along the way. Hazel's mood drifted from befuddlement to sadness to slow boiling anger. She had run through the same emotions years earlier when her oldest son, Jacob, Matthew's brother, packed a suitcase and left his home after he turned 18. Trying to escape my shadow of loneliness, he had ended his farewell letter to Matthew. Jacob was never good at looking anyone in the eye, Matthew thought, but he was pretty honest when putting words on paper. His sympathy for his brother didn't slake his anger at Jacob's secrecy. Matthew had believed the two were a lot closer than they apparently were. When Frank, his father, didn't return after a month, texting that his trip to Mexico would be extended, Hazel said the writing was on the wall. Like oldest son, like father, she observed. She compared her husband to an old sweater with holes in it and declared she had no use for his deceit. Matthew, 13 at the time, consoled his mom. He understood her emotions and she understood his. They needed to think of themselves as survivors now, he insisted, and everything would work out. A year or so later, as a freshman quarterback at Hawthorn High, he led the Bulldogs to a perfect season, on feat unmatched by the school in a decade. Even a bigger miracle, the team won the state championship. When Matthew was named, quote, underclass All-American, end quote, national media picked up on the freshman phenom. In Indiana, people fawned over their homegrown sports talent. Matthew was called by some a celebrity, a cliche bandied about universally, but what did it really mean? How exactly did his star behave? He had no idea. There were so many different expectations for him that he didn't know exactly how he should behave, except the idea of being liked by everybody seemed okay for now. If his father had found out about his successes, Matthew figured, Frank would have given him some advice on the subject, surely. But Frank failed to be in touch from Mexico, and when Matthew tried to reach him, his own emails bounced back with the deadest of echoes. The day passed quickly. By sixth period, the winds had become sharp and stinging, and football practice was called off. Disappointed, Matthew knew at least he had time to rendezvous with Nathan. Knowing the importance of keeping their strategy a secret, they spoke quietly in an uncrowded cafe on Oak Street, referencing notes on their laptops about the upcoming election. Everything was falling in line, promised Nathan. As Matthew's chief of staff and campaign manager, running a political team of 15, he made sure everybody did their job. In about 35 days, Nathan predicted, Matthew would be the new student body president, and his social media following would grow faster than a swarm of army ants. Matthew didn't start home until dusk, his backpack bouncing between his shoulder blades. With the wind ebbing, he glided over the sidewalk, pretending he was invisible, that he could see everyone but no one could see him. Passing a gas station, he did a double take at a gangly, dark-skinned man, his curly hair turning salt and pepper. He was putting gas in a beat-up Ford while talking to a woman in the front seat. Matthew couldn't pull his eyes away. No, he finally acknowledged. He was wrong. The man at Pump 7 had a different voice from his father. His dad was probably still in Mexico, no longer communicating with anyone in Hawthorn, perhaps living on the streets, or maybe finding good work and remaking his life. At times, Matthew felt wounded by his vanishing father, but he also had sympathy for the man who felt overlooked, if not cheated by life. Of course, Matthew realized he wouldn't completely understand himself if he couldn't begin to solve the puzzle of his estranged father. So that tells something about Matthew's being a very talented but conflicted young man, and wanting to be liked by everybody, but never taking the time to really look at himself yet. Not until Britt joins the race for student body president, and she begins her own blog and texting, and begins asking out loud, if you will, do you really know Matthew Navarro? You think you do, perhaps, but he may have another side to him. Britt herself once had romantic feelings for Matthew, but now, running against somebody for president, they are no longer friends. They are exactly, if not enemies, they are competitors or opponents. In this next section, takes place later in the book when the election has not been held, but life is going on. The next morning, before her parents are up, Britt stuck a post-it on the fridge. Be home by 5. Mom and Dad have a great day. She bundled up against a new cold front, sweeping in, and began moving quickly to school. She was grateful for the time to be alone. Within a minute, it seemed, a black town car with tinted windows glided slowly past her. Just ahead, it edged toward the curb and stopped. The back window rolled down. Mr. Barnes pushed his head out, his steaming breath penetrating the cold. Have time to talk, he called to Britt. Keep walking, she told herself. Come on, get in. It's 10 degrees out there. He sounded like he cared, she thought. Britt quickened her pace, moving ahead of the car, and she did not look back. Seconds later, it caught up, and Mr. Barnes stuck his head out again. Mrs. McDowell and I had a good meeting yesterday. I asked her to make sure you were on board for Friday's assembly. Are you? She refused to look over as the car kept rolling beside her. Come on, you know Mrs. McDowell didn't leave me a choice, she whispered to herself. She had to be on board. Sorry, what did you say? Came the authoritarian voice. Britt stopped abruptly, facing Mr. Barnes through his open window. If you want to know the truth, I'm not on board. He looked perplexed and disappointed. Why not? I already know plenty about PTE. Her gaze pleaded with Mr. Barnes to disappear. When he seemed in no hurry to go, her temper uncoiled. Just curious, sir, when one acquires unlimited power, does it come with an expiration date? No need for sarcasm, Britton. You're not really sure how much you know, are you? You're guessing. You used to have a hunch or two. She deliberated, her hands and feet growing numb from the cold, and her curiosity about PTE, as usual, a torment. The rear door swung open. Britt stepped in as if squeezing through a secret passageway. The fact that she was close enough to the door to exit in a hurry reassured her, until the driver accelerated and the car sped off. You don't need to be nervous, Mr. Barnes said, looking away. No one is kidnapping you. I'm not nervous. Britt felt at least he sounded tough. Overall, Jeffrey Barnes appeared to be a gentleman, wearing an expensive suit with a designer tie, his camel's hair jacket with the collar turned up nattily, and a diamond ring on one hand with a wedding band on the other. There was a whiff of cologne in the car, and it was clear he loved tanning salons as much as the principal, Mrs. McDowell, did. This morning he seemed to be put together perfectly, an upgrade from the pale, grizzled gentleman she had earlier seen in a bookstore. You hate rich people, don't you? He said. His smile was directed at the Rolex watch on his own wrist, like it was something he enjoyed admiring every day. How rich are you? She answered with her own question. I pay a lot of income tax. Do I like it? No. Would I prefer giving my money to schools and nonprofits instead of the government? Absolutely. Besides being an attorney, I'm a philanthropist. She was thinking he was a cold-blooded chameleon who changed colors whenever it was convenient. Ultimately, everything and PTE did was about money, she had found out in her research. Can I ask you something, Mr. Barnes? Do you have ideals? Ideals? Any remaining patience drained from his face. Everybody goes through an idealistic phase, including me. Inevitably, it burns out. Why are you so blind to what's ultimately important, Britt? The private sector has no choice but now to help the public sector. Everybody's broke. There are simply not enough tax dollars to go around to fund public schools. Do you want your beloved Hawthorn High School to crumble before your eyes? I can't let that happen, he insisted, before she could say the same words. He said, our country is falling behind the rest of the world. Something needs to be done. And you're one of a handful of young leaders capable of making real change. Really? It was a ridiculous statement from him, she thought. Matthew and Nathan hurt your feelings with their lies and by damaging your reputation, he said. You were determined to fight back. Quite quickly, you came to love the skirmishes. What if I did, she said. Britt, can I be any clearer? You're the real thing. Let me help you run for Congress after you finish college. I have other questions, she interjected, deflecting his offer. Other than the board of directors listed on your website, how many donors do you have in PTE? Get out of the weeds, he scolded gently. PTE can make you a star. That's what counts. Who doesn't want to be famous? Are you telling me you don't want to be rich as well? This was not going to go anywhere, she realized. He almost sounded like a car salesman, touting the same pitch to every candidate he chased after. Could you stop the car, please? I'd like to walk the rest of the way to school. Mr. Barnes directed the driver to pull to the curb. I know you're an only child, he said before she could step out. Did you know that's something you and I have in common? Growing up, I craved belonging to something bigger than myself, having a family around me. That led to playing football. Then I started a hedge fund. Then I ran for political office and won a seat in Congress. And finally, I established a law firm. What about your ambitions? I already have a family, Britt said bluntly. It could always be bigger than Louis and Dorothy, your parents. Have you ever visited the Capitol, the National Mall, or the Senate Chamber? Those are places you don't just see, you feel them. The power is so addictive that in hindsight it will make winning student body president seem like a potato sack race. Mr. Barnes probably knew she'd never been to Washington, just as he undoubtedly knew a lot about her friends, her grades, her SAT scores, and that she was a very mediocre athlete. Maybe he was suggesting that she visit the Capitol with him. How many people in the House and Senate do you help financially? Britt, the ever-curious student, continued. I identified some of your protégés, black, white, Latinx, Asian, and mixed race, male and female, conservatives, liberal, progressives. Congratulations on the diversity, she added seriously. And 2 transgenders, he said. All great, but not if everyone thinks the same way, she replied. She saw that he was growing restless. Why are we having this discussion, Britton? All you need to care about is what I can do for you. Matthew trusted you, then you burned him, she pointed out. No, he burned himself. Britt was getting restless too. Sometimes I try imagining the world as you see it. And, he said with hope, I keep seeing a history class where teachers can only use selectively edited textbooks. Mr. Barnes went silent. Either she had hit a nerve or he found that her implications were ludicrous. She thought of the many sports stadiums, college buildings, and hospitals that had been named over the years for corporations. Was high school for prosperity through education out of the question? I guess we don't have anything more to talk about, Britt said. Except one thing. Mrs. McDowell gave me the names of the Ivy League schools you applied to. That's private information, Britt said before remembering the special connection between Mrs. McDowell and Mr. Barnes. A different Ivy happens to be my alma mater. I can be sure you're admitted to the next freshman class on full scholarship. Dorothy and Louis will be thrilled, won't they? You promised Matthew a college scholarship too. She thought about everyone on Team Matthew. How many had been promised something for their loyalty? Nathan had come out the only winner. He took PTE's money, hoping he and Matthew scored big in Washington, she guessed, but he wasn't counting on it with any certainty. He was someone who always had a plan B, C, D, E, and even an F. Decide where your loyalties lie, Britain. Your new team in college can be your family for life. She was gazing at two girls, maybe 10 or 11 feet away, zigzagging their bikes over the sidewalk, laughing about something. Britt wanted to warn them. She remembered herself at that young age, when one unannounced day she was overcome by the unexpected, the sudden burden of responsibilities, the need to make impossible decisions, and the feeling that nothing made sense, nothing could be taken for granted. I'll have to think about all this, Britt said, exiting the town car. There are leaders in a dozen high schools that I keep track of, he said from the open door. They're all chomping at the bit. I have to be selective. Let me know your decision soon. Are you going to ask your good friend for advice? He tossed in. What friend? Britt said. The history teacher who doesn't comprehend history. Mr. Wilson is a nice man, but he's like those useless gray hairs in Washington. Obsolete. It'll be years before he retires, Britt promised. Mr. Wilson doesn't understand the new laws of history. The past is so fragile that it's breakable. Historians are always reinterpreting what went before. Human beings are the same, changing their minds and perspectives to make themselves feel better. Ego is in our DNA. No geneticist dares to try to remove DNA. Dares to try to remove ego. Human beings can't survive without it. The car disappeared into the morning glare. Mr. Barnes, she thought, knew lots of facts, but he didn't understand what Mr. Wilson called, quote, the lessons, end quote. History had a mind of its own, and its roots went far deeper than did vanity and ego. Then she wondered if she was the one being short-sighted. Mr. Barnes was dangling the keys to the kingdom in front of her. Reach out and take them, Britt thought. After a free ride in an Ivy, she would go into politics and expose Mr. Barnes and his friends for what they were. That wouldn't be easy, but any challenge that seemed impossible, like standing up to a juggernaut, you didn't run from it. The next chapter. The decibel level in the cafeteria. Oh, I'm sorry, that is not what I wanted to read. Excuse me. Several chapters later, Britt took this, and this is after Britt and Matthew. It's after the presidential race. I don't have to say how the race ends, but and spoiler alert, if you figure it out, I can only say that it's not the main point of the book. The main point of the book is the Matthew and Britt relationship and the fate of Mr. Wilson and the importance of history when we don't study it. Britt took a mostly empty bus home from Matt's apartment, revisiting her emotions in silence. She had dropped in, hoping Matt could help with her speech, not expecting her emotions to push her in a different direction. She couldn't fight them, and she didn't want to. After making love, Matt had stroked her back in mesmerizing circles until her anxiety over Mr. Barnes and every other worry was gone for now. How, thought Britt, as she got dressed in her room, could former adversaries turn into lovers if that's where this was heading with Matthew? She hoped history would repeat itself quickly, again and again. They had agreed to connect after graduation. Life was too frenetic at the moment. They would both be in Hawthorn for the summer and had talked about stealing away for a week where no one could find them. Indiana had plenty of nooks and crannies. They agreed to tell no one. That evening, Lewis and Dorothy, after hearing Britt out about the assembly, shared her skepticism over PTE's endless promises. It was a lure that candidates rolled out every 5 to 10 years, depending on how dire and lousy the economy was, Lewis said. Online, in addition to Hawthorn High students, Britt found tons of posts from kids who had seen or listened to Mr. Barnes's assembly live stream. They were both for and against PTE, yet she didn't hear a peep from Mr. Wilson. A call came later in the evening. Lucy began, "Sorry to be the bearer of bad news." "What's up?" said Britt. "Mr. Wilson's disappeared." "What do you mean?" "He's got the flu." "No, Jordan just called me. She heard that Mr. Wilson was terminated from the faculty." "That's impossible." Allegedly, Mrs. McDowell called him at home, shortly after Mr. Barnes' speech and dropped the bomb on him. Can you believe it? Kicked out after 30 years of teaching? Allegedly, Mrs. McDowell called him at home shortly after Mr. Barnes' speech. Britt dropped cross-legged on her bed. On what grounds was he terminated, she said, ready for a fight. Mrs. McDowell will tell the student body something bogus, but Nathan has been claiming from the start that Mr. Wilson was your campaign consultant. After the assembly, he spent half an hour in Mrs. McDowell's office. Jordan says she thinks Mr. Barnes was there too. It felt to Britt that her head was splitting open, and uncontrollable thoughts were spilling out. After Mr. Wilson had first spoken to her about 9/11, she imagined Nathan having the same temperament as the hijackers who had crashed planes into 9/11 towers. She imagined him in the cockpit of one of those planes, sacrificing his life to create discord and fear. She saw Mr. Barnes as a different kind of true believer. He wasn't going to die for any cause. He was the cause. The only question was, what was the next group or organization he would sell his gospel to? Mr. Wilson was not my consultant, Britt said adamantly to Lucy. Sometimes I asked him questions about my campaign, and he gave me general answers. Or he made comments in class that might have been meant mostly for me. Yeah, he wanted me to win. He was insistent that I might be some part of history in the making, but we never had a formal campaign relationship. You don't have to convince me. I'm really sorry. What can I do? Nothing right now. I'll be thinking more clearly Monday morning, Britt said, still dazed. She turned in after 2 a.m., exhausted from studying, yet as usual, her mind wouldn't wind down. Questioning Mr. Barnes at the assembly, putting him on the spot, had been a mistake. Mr. Wilson was getting punished for it, Britt feared. At dawn, she emailed her teacher. Hi, Mr. Wilson. Last night I heard a rumor that Mrs. McDowell terminated you from the faculty. Can that possibly be true? Was it because of me speaking out at the assembly? Or maybe staying after class and peppering you with my questions? I feel terrible. Where are you? She didn't expect to hear from him. They had never been in touch by text or email or phone. But at this point, she felt an urgency to communicate. A lengthy text came back as she was getting out of bed. About to do laps at Muni Pool. I had hoped to tell you myself before the principal makes her announcement Monday. You were not the root of this charade, Britt. You were just a pawn. We can thank Nathan for destroying everything within his reach. But the crucial thing is, you won the election. Mr. Barnes was behind firing you, no? Of course. Mrs. McDowell didn't have any say in the matter. The big dog runs the show now. I should boycott my own graduation. Wrong. This is your opportunity to be heard by everyone. You're the only student juggernaut I know. You're just trying to make me feel better. Mr. Barnes has won for now, but keep asking questions, Britt. Is our enemy a prelude to something more serious? What exactly? I'm betting my money on you to rescue civilization. Ha ha ha. Where will you be teaching next year? Mrs. Wilson wants me to retire, but I think not. I'm a wreck right now. When can we talk in person? You don't need my help anymore. Use that adrenalized, problem-solving brain that got you elected president. No, I mean it. When can we see each other? I'm going to surprise you, and a lot of other people, I suspect. The war is just beginning. What's that mean? Mr. Wilson's texting stopped, and his defiant words about war. Where, when, and how, wondered Britt, would their paths cross again? Right now, she felt an implacable sadness, like she was losing a dear friend forever. I can't reveal what happens at the graduation. That's one of the main points of the novel. But I will say that when Mr. Wilson warns it will be a war, it's like no other graduation ever. The last chapter I'd like to read is about 7-8 minutes long, but it points toward the climax of the story without giving it the climax away. Chapter 46. Matthew walked his mother home from graduation ceremony, her arm locked in the crook of his elbow. After his father and brother had disappeared years ago, Hazel had always had his back. as he had hers. Among his senior year insights, one was the importance of loyalty, as hard as that was to find or give sometimes. His political future had been a sure thing until one day it wasn't. When he lost the race, he had taken down the Team Matthew ship with him. He knew he could have worked harder for his teammates, but he had taken things for granted. He swore to himself he wouldn't let that happen again. He was happy, at least for Britt. Her commencement speech had been a knockout, as she continued to stand up to PTE and the administration. Little could stop her in life, Matthew felt. They were both going to Bloomington for freshman year, and he couldn't wait for that. He was relieved that Mr. Barnes was nowhere to be seen at graduation, yet his presence was always in the air. Starting Monday, when renovation on the school began, paid for by PTE, school buildings and the athletic complex would come first. Eventually, curriculum would get an overhaul too, Matthew believed. PTE was a machine with infinite levers of influence. He doubted Mr. Wilson would get reinstated, and he would bet the teacher knew that too. They were both realists and survivors. The not-so-distant future might depend on adaptation to a new political or social order. As he led his mom across the street, he embraced the emotion of suddenly being on his own. He was done with the generational mantra of team first, individual second, whether it applied to politics or sports. Nathan, despite being a loner, was fine with working on a team temporarily if it gave him enough money and influence. Matthew compared the team first ethos to a sweet-tasting poison. It went down so easily you never thought you would get sick from the need to please others, or the fear of letting them down, or their questioning your judgment if the group thought differently from you. He was done with all of it. When his mother was settled in for the evening, he strolled in the direction of school, the sky shedding the last of its light, but leaving him enough light to read the index card from his shirt pocket. Someone had left it in his locker yesterday. It was handwritten in an elegant font. There was no signature. His first guess was it had to be Britt, that she was having fun with him, echoing his own cleverness of once upon a time leaving notes in her locker. Matt, you are the only prince I know, smart, clever, curious, and unafraid to guess who I am and what I want. Meet me in the administration building after graduation. Does 7 p.m. work? As he approached the administration building, the campus felt deserted. Every white folding chair had been packed away, the dais dismantled, and the turbulence of graduation now tucked into the bank of hundreds of other school memories. His watch beeped at 7 as he marched over the lawn, passing the flagpole in the sticky evening. His instinct suddenly put him on notice. Something felt off. He wished he hadn't left his phone or wallet at home. At least he had developed the habit of bringing something else along should there be trouble. He saw nothing when he gazed through the glass in the front doors. One was locked, but the other beckoned him in, past the administration offices, into an empty hallway crowded with thousands of ghosts shuffling between classes. A few ceiling lights had been left on, but no one was in sight. Was the invitation a senior prank? He was sad that Britt didn't seem to be here, but gradually, as he walked around, he accepted the nostalgia that washed over him. Putting his 4 years into perspective, there had been more ups than downs, he felt now. The trophies celebrating his perfect football season and state championship were enshrined in the glass case that still needed a coat of varnish, as Britt had told him. Not far away were his father's trophies. They made Matthew feel good too, all things to be proud of. He was beginning to feel at peace with his father. Even losing the election had unforeseen benefits, Matthew considered. He and Britt had grown closer. When she showed up at his apartment to ask if he was the person who had once put letters in her locker, there wasn't much space between them on the couch. Making love was inevitable, but the bond they both felt wasn't a surprise. Maybe he'd always known they would end up together. Britt too, he hoped. He ran his hand over dusty lockers, peeked in the classrooms that sparked more memories, and roamed the study halls where so many of his campaigns were born. He was ready to revisit the temple, the name for the athletic complex, but a growling sound made him turn around. "Hey there, buddy," Matthew whispered, steadying the unleashed Doberman 15 feet away. His growling stopped. The dog was staring back with an almost amused look. Matthew took a couple of steps back. What was the Doberman doing in the school? There was no collar or identification that he could see on the animal. Its slick coat was a black and rust mix, and the dog had to weigh 100 pounds. The extended muscular neck looked prehistoric. The Doberman began snarling again, baring its teeth, and trotted closer, like it owned the school and Matthew was a trespasser. He began to think this was Mr. Barnes's idea, perhaps a warning to seniors not to help themselves to a memento or two, or not to take out their Brit-inspired anger by defacing the 117-year-old landmark. The school no longer belonged to students, parents, faculty, administrators, alumni, or even taxpayers. It was PTE's now. He found the Doberman to be the perfect avatar of Mr. Barnes. "Hey, buddy," he called again, softly, as if the two might somehow become friends. The dog raised his chin. Its staccato barking sounded like a machine gun. He counted to 3, turned his back on the Doberman, and ran as fast as he ever had on a football field. Flying up the stairwell to the second floor, he began grabbing at random doorknobs. They were all locked. He twisted his neck back. The animal was catching up, so he threw himself into the nearest bathroom. There was no lock on the outer door, but he secured the stall, jumped on a toilet, and made sure his weapon had not fallen from his front pocket. He was aware that a trained dog could sniff out almost anything, but he was startled when he heard the Doberman push open the main door. The nails of its paws clattered over the tile floor. It ambled to his stall, scratching impatiently at the metal door, which was followed by frustrated howling. "Go away," Matthew whispered, wondered who he was talking to. The dog had already begun to squirm under the door. He jumped from the toilet, pulling out the taser he'd bought for protection after being mugged one day in town. Before he could shove the weapon into the thick neck, discharging 50,000 volts, he took his eye from the dog for a nanosecond. The jaws closed on his wrist. He stifled a yell, only to watch the taser fall from his hand. He grimaced as it slid under the adjoining stall. On his stomach, twisting his torso, his fingers finally touched the taser. The Doberman by now had wrapped its jaws around his ankle, pulling repeatedly on his leg, until Matthew could feel its teeth breaking into his skin. Frantically, he torqued his body toward the dog and jammed the taser into its neck. The Doberman shuddered for a second, whimpered, and slumped to its side, breathing shallowly. Matthew freed his leg. He could smell the dog's saliva on his flesh. The multiple gashes were bleeding. He took off his t-shirt and wrapped the wound, moving to his feet as the dog began to stir again. Matthew limped down the stairs, constantly looking back. As he heard the Doberman, he powered himself to the main door and slammed it closed before the dog threw himself against a thick slab of glass. Catching his breath on the lawn, he wished again he had his phone. Hobbling in the direction of a city hospital, his relief didn't mask a new fear. Any sadist who had left an attack dog in the school was capable of doing almost anything to anyone. Chapter 47. Britt had decided not to go with her parents to dinner, disappointing her father who wanted to celebrate her graduation all weekend. She was too busy collecting signatures for reinstating Mr. Wilson. Feedback was mostly positive, so she didn't doubt she could meet her Monday morning deadline. She had told Matthew about the look Mr. Barnes had thrown her after the assembly. Did he keep grudges? She would never bet against it. Her watch beeped with the city hospital number on her screen. "Hello," she said, cautiously. Were her parents okay? "Are you home?" came Matt's voice. Britt smiled. "Yeah. What are you doing at the hospital? Specifically, are you with your parents?" His tone troubled her. "They're out for dinner, Matt. Why are you at the hospital?" "I'm getting my ankle stitched up. A Doberman attacked me in the administration building." "No way. You're putting me on." "I wish." "At school this evening? What were you doing?" He gave her details about an invitation that sounded like a love letter. "That's crazy, Matt." "Can you call your parents, please? Tell them to come home. I'm not joking." She frowned. "You make it sound like I'm not safe." This is just a hunch. Don't leave the house, but look out on your street. Right now, you see anything unusual? She galloped down the stairs while holding the phone, more curious than nervous. From the living room, she viewed a street that, as usual, was buttoned down for the night. No one was outside. The only thing faintly suspect was a spotless white sedan with out-of-state plates, basking under a streetlight. A car I've never seen is across the street, she reported back. Is that what I'm supposed to be worried about? Somebody put the Doberman in the school just for me. Then I got to worrying. What, you think I'm next? Who? Jeffrey Barnes? I don't know. Someone is behind this, he said. Matt, is your leg okay, she thought to ask. She'd never seen him this anxious. I'm coming over. Just call your parents, he pleaded. I'm going to be slow, he said, clicking off. Britt wasn't sure about interrupting her parents' dinner, not over a strange car on the street. Something else nagged at her. She had been weaning herself from her parents' support all year. Challenged over and over at school, she'd learned to fend for herself. But her nerves were far from steady at the moment. She moved through the house to make sure all the doors and windows were locked. It was 8 p.m. when Matthew checked out of the ER and called his mom to say he would be home later. There was no point freaking her out about the Doberman. He knew plenty about sutures from playing football, but this injury had taken over 30 stitches to close the wounds, plus several more for his wrist. He was told to come back tomorrow to see about taking rabies vaccine. A nurse had tightly bandaged his ankle for support. Due to budget cuts, city buses no longer ran at night, Matthew knew. Hurrying over the sidewalk, his normal speed was hampered by pain. He wanted to be wrong in his warning to Britt, but there were no guarantees. His emotions were like clothes spinning in a dryer, impossible to sort out. Respect, love, frustration, danger, protection, loneliness. His suspicions about the Doberman were equally jumbled. A lot of people could have deliberately left the dog at the school, even someone in the administration, who found Matthew to be some kind of threat. When his thoughts pivoted back to Britt, he made himself run even faster. I hope everyone enjoyed the portions of the book that I read. It was a great novel for me to write, and I hope if you end up reading it, you enjoy it as much as I did in creating it. In conclusion, two quick comments about two characters. One's Mr. Wilson, the 60-year-old, 3-decade-long teacher who started the book with being a witness to the attack on the 9/11 towers, and how that changed his thinking about everything. And I think the larger picture is it changed America's thinking about everything going forward. The event soon became part and parcel of social media. It became the subjects of outrage on various platforms, and really was the start, in my opinion, of polarization in this country. And part of polarization, I wanted to add, is not just people digging in their heels and expressing outrage on a platform, which may make them feel good, but it's also people get tired of the outrage. They get outraged at the outraged, and they kind of get numb, and they just don't want to hear about it anymore, and they get pinned to their belief system. And whether you want to call it passive polarization, I don't know, but it's a sticking point that we have to continue to deal with, and Britt will have to deal with in the year 2030 and beyond. My second quick comment on Britt was she was definitely my heroine. She opened doors that she may not have, or most young people would not have, most adults would not have. But it led to her reassessing her original dream of becoming a doctor, changing that dream into something unknown and even unexplored. But she had the confidence to grow as a human being and to keep an open mind. Thank you.